So this book, The Spiral Shell, is actually a memoir. And I didn't set out to write a memoir. In fact, I didn't set out to write a book. I thought I was going to be writing a series of essays. And it all started when I was awarded a residency in a small town in Southwest France. And I began to, I was interested in the village. I knew it was on the pilgrimage route to Santiago de Compostela in Spain. So I knew it was a Crusaders route. And so whenever I think about Crusaders, I wonder where the Jews were. And so then I began being interested in its World War II history. And I knew nothing about France and World War II and the Vichy government. And I knew some people who did, so I started asking around. And I have a friend who's a poet, and she has written some poetry about some folks during the Second World War in the village. And I said to her, Marilyn, I know this is your material. I don't want to take it, but I'm interested in the subject. And so she said, I have a name for you. Nobody's written about him. He's yours if you want him. His name is John Hirsch. Well, my maiden name is Hirsch. And I'm like, oh, wow. And my father's family came from the Alsace-Lorraine, and his family came from the Alsace-Lorraine. I know this was not a genealogical research. I know we're probably not related at all, but there was just that mystery of sharing that name. And through another friend, I was introduced to a woman who is French, a Jewish historian who speaks perfect English, and her name is Valerie Fert. And she became a friend and a translator. And I'm telling you all this because I'm leading up to the woman who was the driving force of this memoir. And her name was Germaine Poliakov. She was 92 when we met in 2011. And she died in 2000, just about the time the pandemic hit in 2020, February of 2020. She cared for Jewish refugee children in a secret house in Bouillé-sur-Dodon, which is another village in Southwest France. She also happened to be married to Leon Poliakov, her second husband, who was a resistance fighter and also a renowned French historian of the Second World War and also a resistance fighter. So I fell down into this huge amount of knowledge that I knew very little about. And I began, of course, reading. And then I found places where my own story as a woman, as a Jew, and as being interested in this history began to intertwine with the stories that I was researching. So I'm going to just start out by reading you a little bit of the beginning. I don't know how many of you have had a chance to read the book or not, but because the book begins and ends with a personal story, I'm going to start with my own personal story. I knew so little of my own history. On my father's side, I had two names, Henriette Ducasse and Jacques Hirsch, my great-great-grandparents, both born in Héricourt, France, a commune in the Alsace that used to go back and forth between France and Germany, a spoil of war. Newly married, the couple sailed into New York Harbor, and as far as the family knew, they washed up onto American shores without a past. My father told me only those names, no names of their parents, grandparents, sisters, or brothers. No stories of a family's joys or its heartbreaks and struggles. Whatever had gone before evaporated into the air of a brand new world. My father told me stories of his family's American successes, a brownstone on the Upper East Side, a shoe store on Fifth Avenue. A block long, he would say, the space between his gesturing hands growing wider and wider. For me, a child given to fantasy and fairy tales, the shoe store grew into a department store, and the brownstone became a castle. Yet there was truth to my father's stories. I had a newspaper clipping dated 1902, probably from the society pages of the Hartford Courant, announcing a marriage and listing the elegant wedding presents received. Among them, a check of a large amount from Leo M. Hirsch, an uncle of the groom. This was my great-grandfather, proprietor of that block-long shoe store. The Hirsches were German Jews, Reformed Jews, aspiring to both social status and wealth, assimilation their goal. My father taught me that being Jewish was no different from being Christian. It's a religion, that's all, he would say, as if to convince himself as well. He wanted to pass, and he wanted me to pass, not inside the house or among fellow Jews, but in the Christian world. He insisted Hirsch was a German, not a Jewish name. For years, I didn't know he was wrong about our name, but I did know he was wrong about Judaism and Christianity. Growing up, I shared things with my Jewish friends I didn't share with my Gentile friends. A nod, a glance, a meaningful touch on a shoulder. Once visiting Grandma Rose, my father's mother, and Harry, my step-grandfather, in Miami Beach, where they spent winters, I saw a sign in a window of a boarding house, no juice. I saw signs over drinking fountains, colored white. With or without signs, America named its outsiders. In that old newspaper clipping, the word reverend replaced rabbi, temple replaced synagogue. The ceremony was performed by the Reverend Mr. Levy of the Orange Street Temple. When you changed rabbi to reverend, you tossed away centuries of learning, letting assimilation subsume knowledge and culture. When I was a child, school forms asked for my religion. Write Hebrew, my father would say. What's wrong with putting Jewish? Just do it. My friends didn't go around calling themselves Hebrews. We were Jewish. We didn't say Jew, an insult. And because we were growing up in the shadow of the Second World War, we knew about concentration camps, gas chambers, and lampshades made of human skin. We whispered about those lampshades on the playground, the way we whispered about sex, knowing and not knowing, believing and not believing. So, that it gives you just a little hint of how my own past shadows the research that I began to do. Now I'm going to share screen and to take you and show you a few slides, and I'll begin with a let's see, this is what I want, or maybe have I shared yet? No, right?
Yes, you
Yes,
have
I
the
have,
whole,
but
you need to
okay.
start the, yep.
But
there
I
you go.
want to get the right
There you go, play from start. There
how
we go.
about here?
Perfect.
Okay, so now you have a map of France. And so I wanted to show you that the village where I was right about here where my arrow is. Well, maybe about here. And so you can see how close that was to the coast and down in here to the Spanish border, which was an escape route. And so this village was here. Bouilleux-sur-Dordogne was the village where Germaine worked with the resistance as a caretaker in this house. And that house where she worked was also a center of resistance, and the resistance fighters, in fact, her first husband was fought with the resistance, would come to this house in Bouilleux-sur-Dordogne. And I wanted to give you just a little bit of an idea about how far this was from Paris. And so this is what happened when when the Germans invaded Paris and occupied it. Everyone, a lot of people tried, and some succeeded and fled south. The reality was that which you probably know more about than I do, that the Germans truly occupied all of France, but the Vichy government was the sort of nominal head of the South of France. And really what made it possible for Vichy to govern the way they did and for the Germans to do what they did, they had to have the cooperation of the local officials. So that's one thing that I learned that I think struck me. And So in certain places like Bouillon-sur-Dordogne, they did not have that full cooperation. So this was the secret house. And I had expected it to be out in the country and, long hidden driveway. And I met with the town historian through Germaine. She set this meeting up for me. And this house is right in the center of this village, and it's in a small little plaza of its own. And what you can't see, I think you can see my cursor, is over here, and you can just see a little bit of this outline of this dome here, is a huge abbey of St. Peter. And in the front here, there was a restaurant. And there was also, and that was owned by the Leclerc family, Catholic family in the resistance. And they also housed the youngest of the Jewish children in rooms above their restaurant. And off over here somewhere, there was a statue of the Virgin and Child. And I just found this absolutely fascinating because the historian said to me, everyone knew this was a Jewish house. So I just imagined the villagers walking to church on Sunday morning, passing this house, knowing exactly what it was, the priest holding open the door and welcoming them in. And so it just let me know that a kind of coexistence could exist. This is a photo from the 1940s inside the house. This is Germaine as a young woman. Her nom de guerre was Maki. This is her good friend Sultan. And I think her real name was Paulette. And she was, they were roommates together. And what struck me about this photo is this is a clandestine radio. They should not be having this. And this wire snaking up here is an antenna, which was also something that they were not supposed to have. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I am going to share with you a reading about Germaine. And when I interviewed her, I asked her about a single day that she remembered vividly from that time. So Germaine folded her hands loosely in her lap and spoke of a day in 1944 when German soldiers were marching through Bouillon-sur-Dordogne and heading to Normandy. They were nervous, edgy, and shooting wildly. I was. Germaine rounded her hands and drew a dome in front of her belly, expecting my third child, carrying my baby in one arm, dragging Daniel by his hand, and running across a field to woods. I heard a shot. I knew what it was. I wasn't frightened. I felt calm. I don't know why. Naturally, she was frightened, but fear propelled her and gave her strength. A pregnant woman carrying her baby, dragging her toddler, her heart pounding, her belly cramping, adrenaline pumping her legs. I looked into my cup of golden tea. How did she find her way through all that and integrate into the person she had become? A few days before, Germaine's granddaughter, a woman who became very religious and lived in Israel, had come to visit with her children, boys who wore payas, side curls. I wanted to make them lunch, Germaine said. They came from so far. I offered a cup of tea. My granddaughter refused. She would not let the boys eat, not even a cookie. This woman was the daughter of the baby in Germaine's belly that day she raced for the woods. I knew they were Orthodox. Still, I was insulted. I don't like Orthodox. She meant orthodoxy. I agreed. Had I been visiting that day, I would have told that granddaughter to forget her rules of kashrut that allowed her to eat only kosher foods from kosher plates and drink only from kosher cups. I would have told her to take a cup of tea with her grandmother, to let Germaine give cookies to the boys. Their great-grandmother had been to the edge and survived. To break bread, to share a meal with family and friends, this was nachas, a Yiddish word that like most Yiddish words, squiggled out from under definition. Nachas was pleasure, but more than pleasure, nachas was the pure joy a child brought to a parent or grandparent. Speaking English, Germaine said, the more and more I get old, the more I can express what I feel. Only now I realize my life was not ordinary. At the door, Germaine said, people tell me I was courageous to do what I did. I did not know. Perhaps courage is acting not out of bravery, but out of the essence of who you are. Germaine offered her cheek and we kissed. She was tired. She must nap. You are going back to the States, she said. Yes, I said. Germaine and I exchanged email addresses. She took my hand and held on. You must tell me when you will return, not if I would return, when. I thought about journalists coming to interview Léon, her famous husband, but never Germaine as she sat in one of the apricot velvet chairs, looking on, her own story rumbling in her belly. Yes, I would return to listen to Germaine and continue my search for answers to questions I hardly knew. The best way to find what I was looking for was to let it reveal itself. So I think I would also like to read you a short passage from post-war Paris, because Germaine lived in Paris. She was a very, very assimilated French Jew, although her family originally came from Turkey. She arrived in Paris when she was a toddler. So she never considered herself Jewish before the war, but it was only after the war that she did. And after the war, she ended up living in a refugee hotel. She was not divorced from her husband, the father of her 3 children, but he had another woman and he refused to give her a divorce unless she gave him the 3 children. And she refused to give him the 3 children. And he would come, he had money and she did not. He did not send her money. His father sent her some money. And she worked again for the same refugee organization after the war that she worked for during the war. And she was a musician and voice was her instrument. And so she taught music and she led a chorus of children in the house. And she worked in the Marais after the war, also teaching music and leading a chorus. But the irony is that Ralph, this husband who would not give her a divorce, built a bicycle for her. And the bicycle was her transportation. And she took her 3 children, small children, to nursery school. And that was another relief organization running a preschool. And she took them all to school on her bicycle, all 3. And then she rode across half of Paris to get to her job in the Marais. And I had lunch one day with Germaine and with Daniel, who was the oldest child, and with Aline, who was the next child. I never met the 3rd child, Arlette, but we were all at lunch at the table. And I say, a spirited exchange erupted at the table. Earlier, we talked of Germaine's bicycle, the one she rode through post-war Paris, pedaling the children to school. Germaine remembered 2 baskets, one draped over the handlebars and one attached to the back fender. No, Daniel said, only one basket on the front for Arlette. Yes, of course there was a basket for Aline, Germaine said. No basket, Daniel said. Aline rode on the seat. And you? Germaine asked. I rode on the back. Daniel recalled the steep hill and his mother speeding down without brakes. He touched his index finger to his temple. She was crazy. We all laughed because we loved Germaine's craziness. We loved Germaine, and this was what united us all. love crossing cultures and crossing a sea. As for that second basket, I believed Daniel, and it was as if I were seeing them all, Daniel, Arlene, Alette, and Germaine, holding tight and speeding into their day. We need many voices to tell our stories, for the truth lies not in each voice, but in the context of our blended notes. I, too, the storyteller, imagined my version of Germaine on her bicycle, placing her in the warmth of a spring day, pedaling the rutted streets and dodging piles of rubble. Somewhere in the midst of our different stories, we find our common humanity. So I think that that is also one of my goals in writing this book, although they all kind of appeared more afterwards. And that is the whole idea of story and how we find truth within many stories. And I wanted to give an impression of what it was like for people, if I possibly could, to live through that time. I'm going to share screen again, and I'm going to move to the village of Ovilar this time. So let's share screen. And okay, so I think we're all good, right? You've got it?
We're good.
We're good. Okay. Oops. Oh, I forgot that one. That is Germaine the last time I saw her. She was, she would turn 101 the following month. This is November of 2019. And she would turn 101 in December and then die the following February. And she was wonderful. This is almost 101-year-old woman. This is Ovilar, the village. So it's a medieval village. This is the clock tower, and this was one of 3 entrances in medieval times, and each entrance was gated. And it's just very charming and very old and very small. Maybe 900 people live in the village. It's just a little wonderful haven. And because I love flowers and because they seem to love flowers, I just had to include this. This is right in the main street, this wonderful house with all the flowers. This struck me. So I was there in the fall of 2012. And I was walking up a hill and I saw this poster in a window, and I knew immediately what this was. This was an identity card blown up of World War II. So this is the J for Jew. And this is August 26, 1942. That summer of 1942, those were the massive German roundups of Jews. And if any of you saw Sarah's Key, that took place, it happened in July of 1942. Paris was July, the south of France was mostly August. Then Ovilar, 26th of August, 2012. So I had missed this and I couldn't believe it. And so I went to see Gerhard Schneider, who was a friend and German, retired to the village. He was married to Mary Jo French, who was from the area. And Gerhard was a theologian, or is a theologian, and a teacher, and also a student of the Second World War, because he's about a little bit younger than I am, not much. So he has the same kind of memories of the war that I do, only he grew up in Germany, and his father fought on the Eastern Front. He wasn't a Nazi, and that's why he was sent to the Eastern Front. But Gerhard grew up with all of the post-war guilt, and he really was searching for what went wrong, and he became very interested in Jewish history. So I went to see Gerhard about this. And I'm going to read you something again, but this is a soap shop, and you have to know about this. According to Gerhard, the family, that Kurzweil family, who were Bruno Gisela and their 17-year-old daughter Adele, lived in these rooms above the soap shop, La Savonnerie. And this is the way it looks today. I'm sure it didn't look much different years and years ago. When I talked to you a little bit about Adele and her history, their suitcases, they were a family who had emigrated from Austria after Hitler marched into Austria, and their suitcases were packed for travel. Bruno Kurzweil was a lawyer in Graz, Austria. He emigrated to Paris. He worked for the resistance, and he escaped to the south. He was in Toulouse for a while, and then in Montauban. And it became too crowded in Montauban. They needed more safe houses for Jews. So there were 4 families who were sent to Ovillars. And my beloved Ovillars did not protect the families in the same way as the families were protected in Beaulieu-sur-Dordogne. In Beaulieu-sur-Dordogne, there was a single gendarme who would get the lists of the deportees, and he would go to the secret house, which was called La Colonie, and he would knock on the door, and he would say, "You must leave. The Germans are coming." And so Madame Gordon, the director, would take all of these girls. This was a house for girls, and they'd go into the woods and they'd camp until danger passed. Here in Ovillars, it was the gendarmes in the village who actually arrested this family, and they had no relatives. So their suitcases, which were packed for travel because they were waiting for their visas from the Mexican consulate, were all stored in the town hall in Ovillars, and they were discovered more than 50 years later. And it was Gerhard who brought this knowledge to the village, because they were discovered when a workman opened a door because they were doing renovations. And he knew what he was seeing because they were sealed with that official tape. So what happened was, I think that I might read you some of that, but these are Adele's drawings, and this was a page from her diary, and these are her books, and they're all in a sort of makeshift weird museum in Montauban, which doesn't really take care of its stuff. Okay, one more thing I have to explain before I read again, and that then I will open to you for discussion and questions. I want to explain Stolperstein. I don't know how much you know, but Gunther Deming was a German sculptor who wanted to memorialize and we remember, not memorialize, really remember the Jews as people who were taken away. And so he began creating brass paving blocks, and he placed them in front of houses where Jews were taken away. And they generally said here lived or here worked, and then just the name and the dates. And they became very, very popular, and you can find them in many, many, many cities in Europe now. I had actually never seen one. I'd seen pictures of them, but I happened to be in Italy with one of my granddaughters in Rome this past May, and I saw them for the first time in my life, and they're very moving. They are placed so they're just raised a little bit above the normal paving stones, because the point is to stumble over them. So I will stop. I have stopped sharing screen. Okay, So I'm going to read you a bit about this family, Kurzweil and Ovilar. So after I went to speak with Gerhard about that poster, I went to the soap store, La Savonnerie, and inside, I went inside, and I knew the family had lived in those rooms above. I held a dangling earring to my ear, looked in a mirror, turned my head left and right. I was not shopping for earrings. I wanted to linger and feel Adele in these walls. Like Gerhard, I wanted to mark Adele's life with a plaque outside this shop in order to honor not her death, but her life. I fingered a necklace, another pair of earrings. The woman stood as if to signal me, and so I carried a bar of lavender soap to the counter. Wordlessly, she took my money, then slipped my soap into a nearly flat brown paper bag the size of a maple leaf. I had the feeling that if Gerhard were to approach her about a plaque, she would shake her head. No, no plaque. Plaques, though, were common practice throughout both France and Germany. So many plaques in Paris, particularly in the Marais. In German cities such as Cologne and Hamburg, the sculptor Günther Demning embedded Stolperstein, stumbling blocks, shiny copper squares into sidewalks, each square engraved with the name of a Jew who had been dragged away and murdered. Because each stone rose above the pavement, you stumbled, you noticed, you read, here lived, here worked. Standing outside La Savonnerie, I took in the facade with its wide French doors and sash painted the same turquoise as the shutters. With the shutters opened and fastened to the outside of the building, there was no room for a plaque. Why not a Stolperstein? But Ovilar did not want to stumble over its past. I thought about Adele, a teenager, as my two older granddaughters were teenagers. Adele living in the flat above, Adele, a child of war, my granddaughter's children of relative peace and relative prosperity, walking to school, laughing with friends, selfish in the way of teenaged girls. My granddaughters did not glance back into time. Who would lead them there? Perhaps they would have to stumble on their own to learn that the moral dilemmas of the Shoah are ongoing. I stood outside the Tabak and imagined Adele spinning a rack with postcards. Every day the cards were the same. Still she spun, as if seeing this village for the first time. The Church of St. Peter, golden in sunlight, the stone pillars and red-tiled roof of the round market, the ancient chapel of St. Catherine in the old port. Adele spoke perfect, unaccented French, and she wrote in French. She could have passed, but really, in those days, could anyone pass? Inside the Tabak, Adele handed her postcards to the proprietor. Later, in her family's rooms above the soap shop, she would write to Hannah Papanak, her old school friend who had emigrated to the States. As the proprietor slipped Adele's postcards into a paper bag, the proprietor's daughter, sitting on a stool behind the counter, stared in that uncompromising way of children. And that was why, years and years later, she would remember and say to Gerhard, she used to come to my mother's shop. She bought postcards. She had beautiful hair. Late that afternoon, as the sun dropped behind hills and trees, I carried a glass of wine to a picnic table beside the Garonne. Time, circle, and light faded like a blue note wailing. I watched the river's smooth surface and understood that beneath that placid exterior, a strong current pulled. Adele used to come here. She might have even sketched here. Adele had dreamed of designing women's fashions. I'd seen her drawings draped in protective tissue when Pascal Kaya unpacked the family suitcases. A woman in profile wearing a black gown, two girls wearing shorts and tight-fitting tops. In her own hand, Adele had captioned this drawing in English, "Hip, hip, hooray." On the Kurzweil family's last night, Bruno Kurzweil sat at a table composing a letter to a friend. He wrote, "I am anxious about my family. I feel problems coming." Perhaps Adele lay awake in her bed. Perhaps she padded into the parlor and looked over her father's shoulder before he covered his writing with his palm or a blotter. Perhaps they heard it at the same time, the sound of a motor coming closer. Downstairs in front of the soap shop, gendarmes herded Bruno Gazelle and Adele Kurzweil up into the back of an open truck, the kind of truck a farmer would use to transport animals. Were the other families already inside? Were the Kurzweils the first, the second, the last? Each person carried a small bundle, all that was allowed. The Kurzweil suitcases, packed so carefully for travel, stayed behind. As dawn streaked its colors above the horizon and farmers made their way to barns and fields, the truck motored past. And I wondered if anyone had turned to look, or maybe refused to. 7 months earlier at the Wannsee Conference in a suburb of Berlin, the Third Reich had ordered implementation of the final solution, the murder of all Jews. The families from Ovilar were taken to Septfonds, an internment camp outside of Montauban, then to Drancy. Bruno Gazelle and Adele Kurzweil joined convoy number 30, and on arrival at Auschwitz, all three were gassed. And I'm not ending on that note, so I'm going to read you one more paragraph. And this comes again, and what I mentioned here is that celebration in 2012. And I'm in the same place. I'm at the same river. It's probably the same picnic table. It was right across the street from where I was in residence as a writer. In the distance, my neighbor waved and called to the dog. He jumped down and walked, and they walked, woman and dog, along the grassy path that followed the river, the dog bounding ahead, then doubling back. Adele had sat here, not on this bench, not at this table, but here at the river. She breathed, she lived, she dreamed. She hoped and she sketched. Ovilar buried her story, and years later, Gerhard found it and hoisted it up into the light of an August day of commemoration. I imagined Gerhard and Mary Jo leading the villagers from the chapel. They approached the blue suspension bridge and walked along the narrow sidewalk. At the railing, Gerhard lifted an arm as if to give the downbeat. The villagers dropped roses to the river below, long-stemmed, pink and red roses, fragrant, fragile roses, drifting down, then floating. The river swallowed them. Life was like that, fragile, beautiful, and brutal. The villagers did not see her, but she was there, Adele floating above them, wind sweeping her beautiful hair. So that pretty much ends what I have for you, and I would love to have some conversation, questions, comments, anything.
I have a question and I'll show you something I have. I'm just going to share my screen for a second. Can you see this picture? That's a Sulperstein. This one's in front of the Brandenburg, or in back of actually, the Brandenburg gate. Next to the gate was the artist Max Lieberman. He has one in the front. I believe his wife, this is where I took that one, in the back of the house. And they're all through the world, as you pointed out. I think the artist, last I read on Wikipedia, had over 75,000 of them.
Yeah.
So there was a lot.
Thank you, Richard. That's wonderful.
There you go. So I'll stop with that. My question is, how many kids were separated, or were there any children separated from their parents? And if there were, did they get reunited?
all of the 70, there were 70 girls in that house, and all were separated from their parents. They lost one child because she was so homesick, she went back to Paris and she was caught in the roundups. I don't know. I know I did interview, Jermaine introduced me to Yvonne Leeser, who was also in the book, and she was a child living in that house. And she was reunited with her parents, but her parents were so traumatized by the war, and her sister, who was how many years older? 3 years older. So Yvonne was 9 years old in Germany when she was sent to France, and her odyssey of places, finding safe places. She ended up in La Colonie. Her parents ended up in Bouillon-sur-Dordogne, taking shelter there as well. But afterwards, she was only like 13 when the war was over, but she needed to take care of them. Actually, she found work after the war. She actually did okay, but psychologically, who does okay?
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
I'm Rosalie.
Rosalie, would
Yeah, hi.
you mind sharing your video?
I can't seem to get my picture up, but that's okay.
Okay.
My question is this. I'm reading the promo for your discussion time, by the way, which was extremely interesting. It mentions something about a fossilized spiral shell that you found in a wall.
Yeah.
And yet, did you mention that along the way? Maybe I was.
No, I did. Thank you so much, Rosalie, for asking that question. Because everybody asks me, it's an odd name for this kind of book.
Right.
So what happened was this. I knew a lot about one side of the Marais. I every time I go to France, I stay there. In fact, I was just back there this past October. And I was on a walking tour of the north side, the other side of the Marais. And so my tour guide stopped at this very ugly, nondescript building, and he's pointing to something. And he's like, do you see it? Do you see it? Well, I didn't see anything. And then he said it was a fossil. And it was an imprint of a spiral shell, because most of the building blocks in France all come from underneath the city, which the limestone quarries, because France was once an inland sea. And so it had all this stuff. And so I was so taken with this ancient fossil that I hung back and I traced it with my finger. And then I caught up with my group, and then he knew that I was just fascinated with this. And later we went to a garden in this other house, monastery kind of place. And he's looking in what I thought were stones, but they weren't. They were shells. He picked something up and he dropped it into my palm, and it was a spiral shell, tiny spiral shell. And I took that home with me, and it became almost like a talisman for me. And I thought that this is exactly what I'm doing in this book. My information, my knowledge, everything is just spiraling up and up and up. I never knew exactly where I was going, and I never knew how it would all fit together. And I'm just so grateful.
And thank you. I thought I missed something along the way.
You didn't miss a thing, no.
Because it was a wonderful promo that was written about your lecture. And I was looking forward to hearing about that particular thing. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for asking.
Anybody else have any questions? You have to unmute your mics if you do, because everybody's mic is muted, I can see. So if there are no other questions, you can always email me and I can get in touch with Sandell Morse. And at that, I want to thank her for her presentation. It was really enjoyable, and hopefully we'll get her for some other things.
Thank you very much.
So with that, I'm going to terminate the meeting.
Can I just say one other
yes.
thing, Richard?
Absolutely.
I want to thank you all for coming. I love doing this. I love connecting with people, with readers, and I am very reachable. On my website, there is an email. There's a way to reach me if you ever wanted to. And if you read the book and if you have any questions, get in touch with me. I love it.
Wonderful.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all for participating. And next month, I'll send out the email again. I think it's on January 14th, but I will let everybody know what's coming up. Till then, happy holidays. Wish you all the best.